1785, 2 years after the end of the American Revolution, Georgia's General Assembly voted to create a state university, a first for the United States. The university, then called Franklin College, opened its doors in 1801 in the tiny settlement of Cedar Shoals, which was right next to a shallow, rocky section of the Oconee River. The community was renamed Athens a few years later after the ancient city of learning in Greece.
That's the story of Athens we've all heard, but it's not the whole story. People lived, hunted, and farmed along the Oconee River and its tributaries in the area we call Athens for at least 10,000 years. This film tells the long story of the founding of Athens.
The Oconee River was surely the reason people settled here. Indigenous people would have fished at the river's rocky shoals, planted along its banks, and hunted deer, beaver, and bison. Yes, bison, that came to drink the water.
Archaeologists have located 150 sites in Clark County with indigenous artifacts, including this mortar in Walker Park. Archaeologists found pottery, glass beads, and fragments of a pipe bowl under the Kissing Rocks on Prince Avenue.
In the Mississippian period, Native people built giant mounds that acted as community centers and ceremonial sites. They are still here. The Skull Shoals Mound is south of Athens on the banks of the Oconee.
So what happened to those indigenous people and their communities and culture?
First, the Spanish happened. Hernando de Soto, one of the first Europeans to travel through the interior of Georgia, passed this area in 1540, inadvertently leaving behind smallpox, measles, and other diseases that devastated the indigenous population. Okay, flash forward about 200 years after De Soto. By the time James Oglethorpe arrived in 1733 with a shipload of 114 English colonists to establish a tiny settlement near present-day Savannah, the diverse multilingual indigenous people in this area had unified into major nations or confederacies, such as the Cherokee, Yamasees, Chickasaw, and Muskogee, who the Europeans called Creeks.
These southeastern nations didn't try to expel the new settlement, but they did try to make clear how extensive their communities were. In 1737, a delegation from the Chickasaw Nation traveled over 500 miles from what's now Mississippi to visit Oglethorpe. The Chickasaw diplomats drew a map in the sand, similar to this one drawn the same year. They drew their towns at the center and then lines to the Muskogee, Cherokee, and Yamasee.
It was as if they were saying to Oglethorpe, "We're here are our friends, and here are our enemies. Which are you?"
In the decades that followed, the English went for option 2. English and later American settlers, and the enslaved Africans they brought with them by force, soon spread westward. Over the next few decades, a pattern emerged. Settlers would trespass into indigenous territory, provoke a violent response, respond with outrage and violence to it, and then negotiate a new border that gave them more territory. The settlers would then cross the new border, provoke another violent response, and the process would repeat.
The Muskogee fought on the British side of the Revolutionary War. When it was over, a new treaty with Georgia moved the border west to the Oconee River, taking more Muskogee land.
Here's where UGA comes in. In the aftermath of the treaty, Georgia's leaders chartered a state university. To fund it, they set aside 20,000 acres of land along this border and began selling it to white settlers in 1,000-acre plots.
The result was the Oconee War, a series of battles that occurred as Muskogee people tried to police the border and Georgians kept crossing it.
There were 2 key figures in the Oconee War. One was Revolutionary War veteran Major Elijah Clark, and the other was Muskogee leader, known by Georgians as Alexander McGilvery.
Clark attacked a Muskogee border patrol just south of present-day Watkinsville. This battle of Jack's Creek involved hundreds of people and killed at least 25 Muskogee men and 6 Georgians. Clark wanted to go further. He wanted Americans to be able to settle on the Muskogee side of the border. State officials said no. Frustrated, Clark raised a small army with the goal of creating an independent country.
The governor sent the militia to defeat the breakaway nation. Clark's rebels surrendered in return for amnesty. In 1790, the Oconee War was still raging. Hoping to end it, McGilvery and other Muskogee leaders accepted an invitation to travel to New York, which was then the U.S. capital.
McGilvery explained the Muskogee position.
Give us what we ask for justly. Return to us the territory that you have usurped, and the war on our part will cease.
They met with U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and President George Washington. The resulting Treaty of New York was the first treaty between the United States and a native nation. According to the treaty, Indigenous people could no longer live anywhere near the Oconee. With the Muskogee out of the way, the settler population grew rapidly. In 1796, the state split Franklin County in two, creating Jackson County. In 1801, 5 years later, they carved out another county, naming it, ironically, for Elijah Clark,
the man who had led the failed movement to create a breakaway country.
Governor John Millage purchased 633 acres of land in Clark County from Daniel Easley, land Easley had claimed before the Muskogee ceded it.
Enslaved workers began building the university's first buildings, and the first students enrolled.
Athens continued to grow, as did Georgia's settler population. In 1830, Georgia Governor Wilson Lumpkin, whose house is still on UGA's campus, led the charge to pass the Indian Removal Act, which forcibly exiled most of the remaining Native Americans from Georgia to the other side of the Mississippi.
So, Athens is the birthplace of higher education in Georgia, but it also represents a violent end to the much longer story of indigenous communities along the Oconee River.
For over 2 centuries, the celebration of Georgia's flagship university erased the history of the indigenous people who were here long before it. The Muskogee and Cherokee nations are still here, but in much reduced numbers. Community events like the Okmulgee Indigenous Celebration reaffirm that Georgia is their ancestral home. The Georgia Indian Council advises state and local governments on modern issues, and Indigenous students at UGA narrated this film. Only by telling the whole story can we fully understand how Athens and UGA came to be.
City.